by 2050, almost 12% of the global energy demand will come from India alone, and which is why energy sector is one of the most critically important sectors. Artificial intelligence, for example, ChatGPT requires 10 times more electricity to answer one query of yours as compared to a Google search. The irony is, the states in India which are very rich in coal and basic fuel supply like coal, they are actually the ones which are least developed. But let's not forget that technologically we are still dependent on China for provision of PV modules. That too because the process of crystallization or recrystallization of silicon wafers is still handled by 90% by China in the world. Hello everyone. Do you know that India has recently recorded the third highest growth in power generation, only behind US and China? Welcome to this session on changing landscape of India's energy basket. We are going to discuss in this session how energy consumption and production patterns in India are changing and what is the future outlook. So how can India, which is a growing economy, which is in fact the fastest emerging economy in the world, going to meet its power demand? There is already a report by BP which says that the oil demand in the world is fastest growing in India. So by 2050, almost 12% of the global energy demand will come from India alone, and which is why energy sector is one of the most critically important sectors for growth of Indian economy. Now, over the years, almost the capacity that we have included in our electricity and power generation has increased considerably. In fact, from 2015-16 to 2024-25, our total installed power capacity in gigawatts has increased from 300 to 475. In fact, also, our electricity generation over the years in billion units has increased from almost 1150 billion units in 2015-16 to 1800 billion units in 2024 and 25. So why is it that India is witnessing this great demand for electricity? Why is it that we are suddenly experiencing that there is so much need for electricity in our country? This is happening at the backdrop of economic growth, rise in population, and also urbanization. Most important thing, if you discuss about the population growth and rising incomes, India has, as you all know, already overtaken China as the most populous country in the world. Our energy consumption per household or per capita energy consumption has increased by 25% in the last decade alone. Rapid economic growth and industrial expansion also, of course, demands from us that we have higher electricity consumption. Because we are aiming to become a 5 trillion economy very soon, we require electricity to support our schemes like Make in India, production-linked incentive schemes, so that manufacturing sector also remains high in growth. In addition to this, there are also sectors which are quickly electrifying. Transport sector, for example, we knew, as we conventionally know it, was run on diesel, petrol, and other basic fuels. But now, as electric vehicles are coming and occupying the stage, there is quick electrification of the transport sector. Also, things like cooking. There was traditional reliance on LPG, and we are also moving from there to induction stoves or induction cooking, which also requires electricity. Similarly, in agriculture, diesel pumps are being replaced by electric pumps. So these small advancements in technology are also leading to more electricity requirement. Digitalization and emerging technologies are in fact one of the most important reasons why countries across the world will require electricity on a larger scale. Artificial intelligence, for example, ChatGPT requires 10 times more electricity to answer one query of yours as compared to a Google search, which means more electricity. More electricity, that means more data, and for more data, you need more data centers, and to support that also, you need more power. Climate and lifestyle changes, more, let's say, relaxed use of appliances at home, air conditioners, all these urbanization, 40% of the Indian population will soon be living in urban areas, which means again that urban lifestyle has to be supported by appliances which run on electricity. And finally, the government itself is realizing the demand for electricity, and there is a push towards cleaner technologies, which requires expansion of renewable energy and electrification to reduce the use of fossil fuels. So all these factors tell us about the fact that there is a need for rampant electrification, or rather the need to augment our electricity sources. Where exactly is all this electricity being consumed? Where is it going? In generally, sector-wise, if you divide the sources, the energy consumption, over the years, all the sectors, the demand in electricity has been increasing. Energy consumption has only been increasing. And of all the sectors, you can see industrial sector occupies the maximum requirement. It has the maximum requirement. There is commercial, there is industry, there is agriculture, but it is the industry which has the maximum energy consumption in India. So what is energy, India's energy basket? What does it look like? Where does our energy come from? And what exactly do we have as resources? If you talk about source-wise, primary energy supply of India, as you can see, we are still majorly dependent on coal. Almost 60% of our primary energy supply, and we are talking about energy supply in general, not just electricity. So 60% of our energy supply comes still from coal. Although you can see the share of other sources is also increasing, but coal is also not coming down anytime soon. Up after coal, 60%, our maximum primary sources of energy includes oil, which is about 28%, followed by natural gas or gas, which is about 7%. So this is what our general energy basket looks like. Now, if I talk in terms of power generation or electricity, this is generally energy supply. In terms of power generation or electricity, coal again continues to be has the largest share in power generation. Almost 47% of the electricity that is being produced comes from coal, followed by solar energy. Solar energy has a high share of 21.52. So while solar energy is picking up, so let's look at the change, what is happening. Let's look at the change what has happened in the last 3 years. In the last 3 years, there is an increase in the production of coal, but at the same time, the solar energy units have also increased, but far more drastically than coal, which means the composition is moving towards or in favor of renewable energy like solar energy, but that does not mean coal is losing its importance. Coal is also gaining its importance. So if you see, the solar energy has hit the 100 gigawatt mark in India in terms of energy supply, which tells us not just solar energy, but overall the share of renewables in the same graph that we saw is also consistently increasing. India's energy mix is expanding, and like you can see, the brown portion shows fossil fuels and the green portion shows renewables. So in 2010, fossil fuels occupied about 84% of our energy mix, whereas the renewables merely had a 15%. And in 2020, the number changed from 75 to, let's say, 25 approximately. And by 2030, we are hoping or expecting that there will be a complete split of 50-50% between renewable energy and fossil fuel based energy. Now the irony is the states in India which are very rich in coal and basic fuel supply like coal, they are actually the ones which are least developed. And if you look at the map of renewable energy in India, this is where renewable energy in India is concentrated. You will realize that it is on the western and southern states that are prominently exploiting this resource of renewable energy. Which means what? The less developed states in eastern India are still relying on fossil fuels for their growth. And this is what has to change. The states which are lying on the eastern belt of India also have to exploit the renewable energy potential that they have, which primarily in this case would be solar energy, because the western, let's say, coast obviously has the advantage of wind energy as well. And this is the dichotomy that one has to fix in case of India. And the interesting thing is that in spite of this dichotomy, India's energy intensity of our GDP is actually improving, which means while we are using energy to increase our GDP, we are not doing as many emissions as earlier, which in turn means that there is more reliance on renewable energy than fossil fuel for our growth. So let's take a look at how renewable energy or India's renewable energy basket, how well is it performing and what does it comprise of. This is an infographic from Ministry of Power and this is as latest as June 2025. In India's installed power capacity mix, solar power, this is the thermal power occupies about 50%, like you can see 240. Solar power has about 110 gigawatts of power. That is the capacity that we already have. After which is the wind power, which is about 51 gigawatts, followed by hydro, which is about 48 gigawatts. And then of course you have biopower, which is 11, nuclear, which is 8, followed by small hydropower. Small hydropower projects are those which have a capacity of less than 25 megawatts. So this is what is India's current power capacity mix. And if we break down it further, only the renewables, if we break down the renewables further, we realize that the maximum chunk is actually captured by the solar power. Within solar power, we have different types like ground mounted, which means the solar panels are laid on the ground. We have rooftop, which is self-explanatory. That means those which are on the roof, which is you can link it to the Pradhan Mantri Surya Ghar Yojana, Muft Bijli Yojana. Then there is the hybrid solar, which means you are integrating, let's say, a wind farm with a solar panel, and similarly solar power off grid. So solar in turn, within the solar composition, it is the solar power, ground mounted solar power, which has the highest share. After this, as you can see, it is the wind energy, which comprises of about 53 gigawatts, followed by hydro and then biopower. Alright, so this is the current energy mix of India's renewable energy. So does that mean that renewable is the only way to go and coal has no role to play in India's growth story? That's absolutely not true. Coal in fact still has a great role to play in India's growth story. Recently, in fact, the Prime Minister and the Government of India celebrated a historic milestone of 1 billion tons of coal production in India, which means that While as a source of supply, primary energy supply, coal still remains important. It still has a vital role to play in the Indian economy. How? India has the fifth largest coal reserves in the world, and it is also the second largest consumer. If you see, the cumulative coal production on year basis is also increasing by 5%, which is a great number. And we are also reducing our imports on the coal. Our import dependence is also reducing. So on year basis, we have reduced our imports from 23-24 to 24-25 by almost 8%. Coal contributes 55% to the national energy mix, and it fuels over 74% of our power generation. Apart from this, it is also a sector which has a huge role in employment generation and provides employment, direct employment to 5 lakh mine workers. And there are about 350 coal mines in India. So speaking of dependence, because as we all know that India's energy basket is still heavily dependent on imports. While we are increasing our production of renewables and coal, we still have a long way to go in terms of securing our energy basket, in terms of enhancing our energy security in order to protect our interests. So let's take a look at how dependent are we actually on imports. India's crude oil import dependence this year has risen to a record 90%. We used to always remember the number 80-85%. This year, we have a crude oil dependence of almost 90%. And like you can see in the graph, this number is constantly increasing every year. Apart from crude oil, other fuels, or you can say other sources of energy on which India is also dependent on imports, include natural gas. So to the tune of 45 to 50%, we are dependent on imports for natural gas. Coal, since of course we have a lot of domestic production of coal, the number is relatively less, but 85% it is still there for coking coal. Renewable energy, while the number as such is less, but let's not forget that technologically we are still dependent on China for provision of PV modules. That too because the process of crystallization or recrystallization of silicon wafers is still handled by 90% by China in the world. That process is known as Siemens process. So we are still dependent on China for those silicon wafers. Of course, we are here assembling in India, but at the same time, our main requirement of the key ingredient in the formation of PV modules is the silicon wafers, for which we are still heavily reliant on China. And finally, nuclear fuel or uranium. Again, we are dependent on imports from countries like Kazakhstan and Canada for our requirement. So don't you think that this energy dependence, this huge energy dependence that we have, does have a toll on not only on our economy, but also on our political ability or our geostrategic influence across the world? Let's take a look at what are the different implications that our fuel import or energy import has on the economy and otherwise. First and most important is we have a high trade deficit and fiscal burden. In fact, about 25 to 30% of India's total import bill comes straight away from energy sources. Then there is heavy reliance from imports from Middle East, which exposes India to more geopolitical risks. So for example, the Gulf crisis, the Red Sea disruptions, you can talk about the Strait of Hormuz, Malacca Strait. These straits become the choking points for supply or shipping of crude oil from Middle East, and which is why it makes India very vulnerable to these threats. There is also a renewable technology dependence because, like I told you, we are dependent on China for basic raw material of renewable energy. In fact, not just solar, but wind also Most of the equipment that comes in India comes from China. There are also other issues, like for example, our import dependence. It undermines our self-sufficiency and resilience during crisis. So, for example, we have already seen during the current Ukraine war, India has had to take certain stands in the international arena, which it may not have had to earlier, but again, it changes the geopolitical relationships, the friendships that you have with other countries. We also not only have limited domestic production, but we also have poor strategic petroleum reserves. Our current petroleum reserves are only capable of, let's say, providing 10 days of crude oil supply to the country. Of course, if you include everything that is with the OMCs, it goes on to 75 days. But still, our strategic petroleum reserves alone can only support about 10 days supply or demand of what India has. And finally, if you are easily able to import crude oil, energy, anything, any sort of energy supply, then obviously the incentive, or the push that you would have for domestic production, for let's say exploration, etc., also goes down. And that is also one factor which has to be catered to, factored in. Next, we see what are the measures that we can take to enhance this security. What are the measures that we can do, or the government has been undertaking to enhance India's energy security? First and foremost is diversification. We are trying to diversify the sources of our energy, whether it is, let's say, whether it is renewable energy, whether it is nuclear energy. We are trying to diversify our sources so that we are not dependent on one critical supply chain. Next is also reducing our import dependence. So we are trying to boost the domestic oil and gas production. We are trying to diversify our suppliers from the world across. So for example, Russia, all these things we are trying to diversify so that there is hedging and we are not risking our interests. And in addition to that, you have strategic petroleum reserves. We are trying to augment those resources. Alternative and clean fuels. So for example, ethanol blending, 20% ethanol blending is also a means of reducing our consumption of crude oil and also reducing the import bill. Energy efficiency and demand management, so that there is less consumption of energy as such. And also infrastructure and storage development. We not only need electricity generation, but whatever is being generated in terms of batteries, in terms of pump storage, hydropower, we should be able to store that electricity also. And finally, we are trying to link our energy policy with our climate goals so that they are in tandem with each other and we are not causing more pollution or affecting the climate. Some of the key initiatives that are driving renewable energy growth in India from the government point of view are the schemes such as PM Kusum, which is related to rural electrification. Then you have the Surya Ghar Muft Bijli Yojana, which is about household rooftop installation of solar plants. Then you have green energy corridors, high efficiency solar PV modules, production linked incentive schemes, National Green Hydrogen Mission, also which tries to find an alternative source, cleaner source to fuels and fossil fuels. So these are some of the initiatives that can be discussed, that can be also understood in this context. But in spite of all this, there are some challenges, that infrastructure and technological challenges that India's energy sector is also facing. The most important one is, in spite of production, we are still reeling with transmission and distribution losses. There are still transmission and distribution losses to the tune of 15 to 20%. We have aggregate technical and commercial losses of 15 to 20%, which is still highest globally, one of the highest globally, which means technologically we still need to improve. Our renewable energy, though the capacity, installed capacity is high, we have not been able to integrate it with the grids properly. And that is because of the problem of intermittent supply. like renewable energy, like solar and wind, is not always present. That intermittent power supply issue has not been resolved till now. Although India has the highest synchronous, one of the largest synchronous electricity networks in the world, yet we have not been able to integrate renewable energy into that. Apart from this, there is lack of grid scale storage. Like I told you, batteries are not there, pumped hydro storage is not there. So even if you are creating electricity, there is not enough infrastructure to store that electricity. Many coal plants are inefficient, so they have a plant load factor of about 60%. 60% means whatever maximum they could work on, they are merely working on an efficiency of 60%. And solar power plants, on the other hand, like solar parks, they have even a worse plant load factor of about 40%. So which means while we are generating capacity in huge quantities, the actual output or efficiency is quite dismal. Environmental retrofitting, also with fossil fuels or thermal power plants, there has been huge hue and cry about flue gas desulfurization units which should be installed. Every time the deadline keeps extending, and that is not happening. For electric vehicles, we have a sparse EV charging network. There are not enough charging stations, especially in, they are only restricted to the metro areas. There are not in the rural areas. And despite universal electrification, while we have achieved universal electrification in 2018, all rural villages of India are connected to the electricity grid, yet the power supply remains uneven and unreliable. So with so many challenges that India is facing in the power sector, what is the demand, what is the supply, and we are trying to become a 5 trillion economy, India also made certain pledges or certain promises at the international fora that we will change our energy dependence from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And for this, India gave its Panchamrit pledge at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Under the Panchamrit pledge, India had made certain commitments, such as that by 2030, the non-fossil energy capacity will reach about 500 gigawatts. This is what we had promised, that by 2030, our non-fossil energy. Now, please understand, non-fossil energy is different from renewable energy because it can also include nuclear. Nuclear is non-fossil, but nuclear is not renewable 100% because it relies on a raw material like uranium, which is not easily replenishable. Okay, so non-fossil energy capacity by 2030, we have targeted about 500 gigawatts. Let's see how much have we done. Well, we already have. India has achieved 50% clean power capacity 5 years ahead of its growth target. Okay, so currently our non-fossil fuel energy capacity is about 242.8 gigawatt, which is about 50% of our total power in capacity. And this is exactly what was our second goal, which was renewable energy will meet 50% of its energy demands. That 50% of India's energy demands will be met by renewable energy, and we have already almost achieved this. Another target was that India should generate a carbon emissions or will reduce its carbon emissions by 1 billion ton by 2030. So we already have created an additional carbon sink through the means of afforestation and other ecosystems. We already have an additional carbon sink of 1.97 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent between 2005 and 2019. And by 2030, we are aiming that we should have a carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And finally, we want to reduce the carbon intensity of our economy or GDP. That means how much emissions it takes to raise the GDP by 1 unit. We wanted to do this. We have a target of 45%. Already between 2005 to 2019, we have seen a 33% decrease in the emission intensity of our economy. So that means India is definitely on the way, on the path to change its energy landscape, moving from an era of fossil fuels, traditional conventional fuels, to renewable energy, cleaner technologies. And in that direction, we are on the right path. We are also using the help, or we are also taking the help of many schemes and foreign investments. So, for example, India's renewable energy sector has seen an eightfold surge in FDI since financial year 21 and has had hit a record this year in 25. Also, the government committee on nuclear power has also suggested that we should allow for 49% of FDI. Under renewable energy, our FDI policy is 100% under the automatic route. So we are welcoming foreign investment with open arms so that our energy security is enhanced, made more secure, and India becomes a more self-sufficient country in power generation and economic development. On that note, I hope you enjoyed this short summary on India's changing energy landscape. Thank you.